May 1940. Europe is collapsing. German paratroopers are falling from the sky. And in the middle of the chaos, 651 British guardsmen board two slow ferries with almost no armor, no air cover, on what could be a one-way mission. Their target, the Queen of the Netherlands, outgunned, outnumbered, surrounded by the Luftwaffe. This is the forgotten rescue that almost never made it home. They thought Britain would send an army. Instead, Britain sent a battalion. As German forces smashed into the Netherlands on May 10, 1940, paratroopers seizing airfields, Stuka dive bombers screaming overhead, Rotterdam burning in the distance, the Dutch government realized something terrifying. They were about to be cut off, captured, erased. And London knew it. But the British Army was already stretched to the breaking point in France. There would be no massive relief force, no armored divisions rolling across Dutch highways. What they could spare was 651 men drawn from the Irish Guards and reinforced by a single company of Welsh Guards, ceremonial soldiers, palace protectors, men more familiar with Buckingham Palace than battlefield chaos. Now they were being handed a mission that sounded closer to suicide than strategy. Cross the North Sea, land at the Hook of Holland, advance toward The Hague, extract Queen Wilhelmina, her family, the Dutch government, and British diplomats. Hold the port if possible, all under total German air superiority. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Haydn understood exactly what this meant. No heavy armor, barely any anti-tank weapons, minimal transport. If the Luftwaffe caught them at sea, the slow civilian ferries would become floating coffins. But failure was not an option, because if the Queen fell into German hands, Dutch resistance might die before it ever began. So on May 12th, in rough seas and fading light, Harpoon Force sailed straight into the storm toward a coastline already burning. Dawn broke over the Hook of Holland like the end of the world. Smoke coiled into the sky. Rotterdam burned on the horizon. And as Harpoon Force disembarked from their slow civilian ferries, the first sirens began to wail. Then came the scream. German Stuka dive bombers plunged out of the clouds, their engines howling like metal banshees. Bombs exploded along the docks. Machine gun fire raked the streets. The guardsmen, still forming up, still unloading, were under fire within minutes of touching Dutch soil. This wasn't a landing. It was a gauntlet. Colonel Haydn wasted no time. With almost no vehicles and barely any heavy weapons, he spread his 651 men into a thin defensive perimeter around the port town. Bren guns were dragged into position. Boy's anti-tank rifles were set up more out of hope than confidence. Every road leading in was covered, because somewhere beyond the smoke, the Queen was coming. Throughout the morning of May 13th, the sky belonged to the Luftwaffe. Stukas dove again and again, bombing refugee columns, strafing traffic, tearing into buildings. German snipers and advance elements probed the British lines from the countryside. The guards fired back disciplined and steady, but they were fighting blind under constant aerial assault. Then just before noon, black staff cars appeared through the haze. A long procession. Queen Wilhelmina had made it. Her convoy swept into the British perimeter as bombs detonated in the distance. Guardsmen formed a protective corridor through shattered streets toward the quay. No ceremony, no pageantry, just urgency. Within minutes, she was aboard HMS Hereward, racing for England. One objective complete. But the nightmare wasn't over. The Dutch cabinet still had to escape. British diplomats were still on the road. And Harpoon Force was still standing in a burning port surrounded with German forces tightening the noose. By late afternoon, another convoy burst through government ministers, embassy, staff civilians crammed into cars. Chaos erupted on the docks as bombs fell closer. Men shouted over explosions. Civilians stumbled toward waiting destroyers. Smoke choked the air. 7 guardsmen were already dead. More lay wounded, and still Hayden held the line. Because until the last car arrived, no one was leaving. But holding the line was becoming impossible. Night fell on May 13th with no relief in sight. The docks were shattered. Ammunition dumps burned out of control rounds, cooking off in the flames like firecrackers from hell. Harpoon Force stood to all night exhausted, soaked in sweat and seawater, flinching at every distant engine note in the sky. By dawn on May 14th, the truth was undeniable. The Netherlands was collapsing. German airborne troops were landing in force. Enemy patrols were now clashing directly with British outposts beyond the perimeter. Refugees flooded into the shrinking defensive zone, families dragging carts, children crying, civilians looking to the guardsmen as if they could stop an entire mechanized invasion with rifles and grit. And above it all, the Luftwaffe hunted freely. Wave after wave of bombers pounded the port. Stukas dove so low the men could see the pilot's goggles. Machine gun fire stitched across the docks. More British soldiers fell. The Royal Navy destroyers waiting offshore couldn't risk closing in under that kind of air assault. Then disaster struck. Hayden's wireless trucks, the only reliable link to the fleet, were destroyed in the bombing. Communication was gone. Harpoon Force was isolated. For a moment, it looked like the mission that had saved a queen might now doom the rescuers. Then, in an act of almost reckless courage, a single Irish guardsman climbed to the top of a windmill overlooking the burning town. Under sniper fire exposed against the skyline, he began signaling the destroyers with semaphore flags. Flag by flag, letter by letter. Out at sea, the Royal Navy saw him. Soon after Hayden gave the order, collapse the perimeter. Fall back to the docks. Prepare to evacuate. It was a fighting withdrawal through smoke and rubble. Units disengaged under fire, carrying wounded, covering each other, street by street. German forces were pressing closer now. The docks were an inferno of twisted metal and shattered timber. And still the destroyers had to come in. Finally, cutting through smoke and spray, 3 gray shapes emerged: HMS Wessex, Vesper, and Malcolm. They surged toward the quay under intermittent air attack, sailors manning anti-aircraft guns as bombs splashed around them. Half platoon by half platoon, the Irish and Welsh guards boarded. No panic, no stampede, just disciplined, controlled movement under fire. The last men leapt aboard as bombs fell dangerously close. Then the destroyers turned west. For 8 long hours, German aircraft harried them across the North Sea. But somehow, against the odds stacked, from the very beginning, Harpoon Force reached Dover that night. 2 days later, the Netherlands surrendered. But its queen was safe. Its government would fight on from exile. And 651 guardsmen, outgunned, undersupplied, and nearly forgotten by history, had pulled off one of the most daring rescue missions of the early war. Not a grand army, not a sweeping victory, just grit, discipline, and the refusal to fail. They made it home, but history barely noticed. Within days, the world's attention shifted to Dunkirk, hundreds of thousands trapped on French beaches, an evacuation on a scale so massive it swallowed every smaller story whole. And Harpoon Force. It faded into the background, a footnote in a week of catastrophe. But what those 651 men accomplished mattered, because when the Netherlands surrendered on May 15th, it did not surrender its voice. Queen Wilhelmina was already in London. So were key members of her government. From exile, she would become a rallying symbol for Dutch resistance, broadcasting messages back into occupied Europe, defying Nazi control, keeping alive the idea that the Netherlands still stood. That future existed because a single British battalion sailed into a firestorm. The cost was real. 9 Irish guardsmen and 2 Welsh guardsmen never came home. Others were wounded, some captured after being sent to Dutch hospitals. Today, they lie buried in Dutch soil, the same ground they fought on for barely 48 brutal hours. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hayden was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership. He would go on to serve with distinction in British commando forces. Several others were decorated for gallantry. But medals don't fully explain what happened at the Hook of Holland. This wasn't a perfectly planned operation. It was improvised, under-supported, launched without air cover, and with almost no margin for error. Communication failed. Ammunition burned. The docks were bombed into rubble. At one point, the entire force depended on a lone guardsman signaling from a windmill while enemy fire snapped past him. And yet, they succeeded. Not because they had superior firepower, not because they controlled the skies, but because discipline held, because leadership didn't crack, because sailors risked their ships to come in close under bombing, because ordinary soldiers did extraordinary things without expecting headlines. Harpoon Force proved something in those desperate early days of 1940. Britain might be retreating, outmaneuvered and battered, but it was not broken. In the shadow of Dunkirk, a smaller miracle had already taken place. A queen saved, a government preserved, a resistance kept alive, and a battalion of guardsmen who stepped onto Dutch soil knowing it might be a one-way trip, and went anyway, forgotten by many, but never insignificant. And here's the part history doesn't always tell you. Harpoon Force wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a message. In May 1940, the Nazi war machine looked unstoppable. Blitzkrieg had ripped through borders like they didn't exist. Paratroopers fell from the sky. Cities burned in hours. Governments collapsed in days. The psychological shock alone was devastating. If Queen Wilhelmina had been captured, paraded as a trophy of conquest, the impact would have been enormous. Dutch morale could have shattered completely. Resistance movements might have struggled to organize. The narrative would have been simple: Germany wins, everyone else runs. But that's not what happened. Instead, a British battalion crossed hostile waters, fought under total enemy air superiority, held a perimeter against growing German pressure, and pulled off a clean extraction under fire. No grand speeches, no cinematic slow-motion charges, just controlled aggression, steady nerves, and absolute refusal to quit. And that mattered, because wars are not fought only with tanks and aircraft. They are fought with legitimacy, with symbols, with belief. From London, Queen Wilhelmina became a powerful voice of defiance. Her broadcasts into occupied Holland reminded her people that their nation still existed even if their homeland was under occupation. That continuity of government helped fuel resistance networks that would sabotage, gather intelligence, and fight quietly for years. And at the center of that chain reaction were 651 guardsmen who had every reason to believe they might not come back. They sailed anyway. They stood their ground anyway. They boarded those destroyers last, not first. Harpoon Force didn't change the map in May 1940, but it changed the story. In a week defined by retreat and desperation, it proved that even in collapse, courage could carve out a victory. Small, surgical, strategic. A queen saved, a government preserved, a future secured. And somewhere in the Netherlands today, quiet graves mark the men who made that possible. Soldiers who stepped into chaos without guarantees, without air cover, without certainty, and came out having altered the course of a nation's survival. That's not a footnote. That's legacy. And decades later, the echo of Harpoon Force still carries. Because what happened at the Hook of Holland wasn't just about May 1940, it was about what kind of war Britain was going to fight. The early months of World War II were brutal. Norway had fallen. France was teetering. The British Expeditionary Force would soon be scrambling for survival at Dunkirk. Across Europe, the Wehrmacht looked invincible, fast, coordinated, ruthless. In that atmosphere of collapse, perception was everything. Harpoon Force sent a signal to allies and enemies alike. Britain does not abandon its partners. Even when overstretched, even when outnumbered, even when the skies belong to the enemy. The mission had been improvised. Intelligence was incomplete. Air cover was non-existent. Heavy support minimal at best. And yet the operation succeeded because of something far less tangible: professionalism under pressure. The Irish Guards and Welsh Guards were not elite commandos at that point. They were traditional guards, regiments, disciplined, ceremonial, proud. But when history called, they adapted instantly. They shifted from palace duty to combat extraction in a matter of days. And they performed like veterans of a different kind of war. Colonel Joseph Haydn's calm leadership under impossible constraints became a model of controlled aggression. Bold. The objective: protect the civilians, extract in order, no panic. His Distinguished Service Order was more than a medal. It was recognition that leadership, not firepower, had carried the day. The Royal Navy destroyer crews deserve equal credit. Closing on a bombed-out port under active Luftwaffe attack took nerve. One well-placed bomb could have turned those gray hulls into burning wrecks in shallow water. Instead, they came in fast, loaded the guards under fire, and turned for home without hesitation. It was joint action at its rawest. Infantry, Marines, sailors, no glory, just execution. And here's the lasting truth. Harpoon Force proved that even in retreat, Britain could still strike with precision. That even in strategic collapse, tactical courage could create strategic consequence. That small disciplined units could shape events far beyond their numbers. By the time the war ended 5 years later, Europe would look very different. But in those desperate 48 hours in May 1940, the survival of a government and the symbolic survival of a nation rested on 651 men standing in smoke and fire. They didn't know how the war would end. They only knew their orders, and they carried them out. And if you walk the quiet cemeteries near the Hook of Holland today, You won't hear the roar of Stukas or the crack of rifle fire. You'll hear the wind, and beneath that wind lie 11 names, 9 from the Irish Guards, 2 from the Welsh Guards, young men who stepped onto foreign soil for a mission that lasted barely 2 days, but shaped the course of a nation's war. They didn't know they were preserving a government in exile. They didn't know future historians would debate the strategic weight of their actions. They didn't know Dunkirk would eclipse their story within weeks. They only knew this: hold the line, get the Queen out, do not fail. Harpoon Force was never meant to be legendary. It wasn't a massive amphibious assault. It wasn't backed by air fleets or armored divisions. It was 651 guardsmen, a handful of Royal Marines, and 3 destroyers gambling everything under enemy skies. And yet, in those 48 hours, they achieved something rare in the early war: a clean, decisive success against the momentum of blitzkrieg. The Netherlands fell, but its sovereignty survived. From London, Queen Wilhelmina became a defiant voice, speaking to her occupied people over radio waves that the Nazis could not silence. Resistance networks would grow. Intelligence would flow to the Allies. Dutch forces would continue the fight overseas. That continuity began on a smoke-choked dock under dive bomber attack. History often remembers the massive turning points, the invasions, the surrenders, the grand offensives. But wars are also shaped by smaller hinges, moments where disciplined men under impossible pressure choose steadiness over panic. Harpoon Force was one of those hinges. A battalion that could have been wiped out. A mission that could have ended in disaster. An extraction that could have turned into captivity. Instead, it became proof that even in the darkest week of 1940, resolve could punch above its weight, not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. And sometimes in war, necessity is the birthplace of legacy. And maybe that's the final truth about Harpoon Force. It wasn't destiny, it was decision. In May 1940, Britain stood at the edge of strategic disaster. The Wehrmacht was rewriting the rules of modern warfare in real time. Nations were collapsing in days. The old assumptions, static defenses, slow mobilizations, predictable fronts, were being obliterated by speed and shock. In that chaos, leaders had a choice: play it safe, preserve manpower, except that the Netherlands was already lost, or risk a battalion to save what couldn't be measured in square miles legitimacy. They chose to risk it. And that decision rippled outward, because when Queen Wilhelmina spoke from London, she wasn't a monarch in hiding, she was a sovereign who had escaped the trap. When Dutch resistance fighters sabotaged rail lines or passed intelligence to the Allies, they weren't acting for a defeated ghost state, they were fighting for a government that still lived. That thin line between collapse and continuity, it ran straight through the burning docks at Hook of Holland. Harpoon Force proved something essential in modern war. Sometimes the most powerful operations aren't about destroying the enemy. They're about preserving the future. It showed that elite professionalism isn't about flashy heroics. It's about composure under bombardment. It's about disciplined withdrawal instead of chaotic retreat. It's about boarding the ships last, making sure the civilians are already safe. And in the long arc of World War II, those traits would define the Allied comeback. From Dunkirk's evacuation to D-Day's landings from North Africa to Normandy, Britain, and its allies would fight with a stubborn consistency, absorb the shock, stabilize, adapt, counterpunch. Harpoon Force was an early glimpse of that mindset. A small unit, a limited objective, a razor-thin margin for error, but flawless execution. The Netherlands fell in 1940. The Third Reich fell in 1945. Between those two dates lies a chain of moments, some massive, some nearly forgotten, where courage bought time and time bought victory. Hook of Holland was one of them. 651 guardsmen sailed into an inferno, so a nation's voice would not be silenced. They didn't stop Blitzkrieg. They didn't change the map that week. But they ensured that when the war was finally won, the Netherlands would still have a throne, a government, and a story of defiance that began with smoke steel and men who refused to turn back. But here's the question history rarely dares to ask. What if they had failed? What if those slow ferries had been spotted earlier? What if a single Stuka bomb had ripped through the docks at the wrong moment? What if the destroyers had turned back under air attack? Imagine the headlines in Berlin. The Queen of the Netherlands captured. Her government paraded as proof that resistance was futile. A neutral nation crushed, and its monarch displayed as a symbol of Nazi dominance. In May 1940, perception was power. Blitzkrieg wasn't just about tanks, it was psychological warfare. Every rapid surrender fed the myth of German invincibility. If Wilhelmina had fallen into Hitler's hands, it would have been a propaganda victory of enormous scale. A queen in captivity would have sent a chilling message to every small European nation watching the storm roll, and Britain cannot protect you. Dutch resistance might have fractured before it ever formed. Collaborationist structures could have solidified faster. The continuity of government, the legal backbone that later supported resistance networks, intelligence operations, and allied coordination could have vanished overnight. And strategically, a fully consolidated Netherlands under tighter Nazi political control would have strengthened Germany's grip on the North Sea coast. More secure ports, more stable airfields, fewer internal disruptions, a quieter rear area for U-boat and Luftwaffe operations. All because one extraction failed. History often turns on battles measured in thousands of casualties, but sometimes it hinges on a convoy reaching a dock, on a destroyer captain choosing to come in under fire, on a single guardsman waving semaphore flags from a windmill while bullets crack past his head. If Harpoon Force had been overrun, the story of early 1940 might have felt even darker. Dunkirk would still come. France would still fall. But Britain's credibility as a defender of allies would have taken a brutal hit. Instead, when Europe looked unstoppable under Nazi boots, one small operation proved something different. Germany could advance, but it could not control everything. Not the sea, not British resolve, and not the escape of a queen who would continue the fight from beyond its reach. Sometimes history is shaped not by massive offensives, but by the disasters that never happened. And in the end, strip away the strategy. Strip away the maps, the arrows, the timelines. What you're left with are men, not myth, not legend, men. The Irish Guards, drawn from a divided island, Catholics and Protestants serving side by side under the same colors. Soldiers who one week performed ceremonial duty outside Buckingham Palace, and the next were sprinting through bomb-cratered Dutch streets under dive bomber attack. The Welsh Guards' reinforcements folded into a composite battalion with barely any preparation time. No grand buildup, no months of rehearsal. Just orders issued fast, executed faster. The Royal Marines scraped together from ships and shore stations, holding a fragile dock long enough for the main force to land. And somewhere in that chaos, one guardsman climbing a windmill. Think about that image. The sky filled with German aircraft, snipers probing the perimeter, bombs tearing apart the port, communications destroyed. So he climbs higher, exposed, a lone figure against smoke and flame. And he starts signaling the fleet with flags, slow, deliberate motions, while bullets crack past him. That's not cinematic fiction. That's discipline under fire. That's what held the line. 9 Irish guards, 2 Welsh guards, buried in Dutch soil today. Their mission lasted less than 48 hours. Their impact lasted the entire war. Because wars aren't sustained by equipment alone. They're sustained by cohesion, by trust, by the unspoken agreement that when orders come, no matter how dangerous, you move forward together. Harpoon Force wasn't the largest operation of 1940. It wasn't the bloodiest. It wasn't the most famous. But it was a test of whether Britain, under immense pressure, would still act boldly for its allies. A test of whether professionalism could overcome chaos. A test of whether courage could exist without spectacle. And those men passed it. Today, the Irish Guards still rotate between ceremonial duty and global deployments. The traditions remain. The discipline remains. The quiet expectation that when the moment comes, they will step forward. In May 1946, 151 of them did exactly that. They didn't know they were preserving history. They were simply doing their job. And sometimes, that's what changes the world.